Well, we are now at the end of the line. We are in our final week of the semester, and this is my last lecture. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the 1970s and 80s to kind of make sense of deindustrialization before we move to the 21st century. Take a minute and look at these two graphs. You've seen the bottom one before, but the top one shows something very specific. Look at what kinds of jobs are increasing in the second half of the 20th century and which jobs are decreasing. So it's service sector jobs that are going up and manufacturing jobs that are going down. So think about how many of you might have had service sector jobs before, and do they pay well? Do they have benefits? So, we've got an increase in jobs, but what kinds of jobs are going away? In the 1970s, the Northeast and the Midwest lost over 2 million manufacturing jobs. And that continued in the 1980s. And just in 1982 alone, 1.25 million industrial job layoffs occurred. There was an 11% unemployment rate that same year. And unsurprisingly, the unemployment rate for Black men was twice that level, passing 21% the next year. And so, of course, these rates are always high, but just as we saw in the Great Depression, people of color experienced them even more significantly. And between 1 and 3 million Americans were made homeless in the 1980s. So again, if you think back to the video that we saw of Reagan and what he was, what vision of the United States he had, what vision of America, who was he including, and what stories were being left out. And children living in poverty increased significantly. And so there's some really difficult things happening during that period. Additionally, mass incarceration begins. In June of 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. These are all things that you've been hearing about with much greater attention in the last couple of years. And the presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, thanks to his expansion of the drug war. So the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by the end of the century. So just in general, imprisonment and incarceration in the U.S. is higher than in most other countries, and the war on drugs really expanded that. And so here with these numbers, you can see that drug offense imprisonment rates increased for everyone, but they disproportionately increased for Black and Latinx Americans. So you're continuing some more work with Angela Davis this week. So as you read this, please note that you heard her speak already in the Black Power mixtape, and also think about how these policies have continued well into the 21st century. Events since 2000 underscore the utter unpredictability of the future. The 2000 election was the first in 112 years in which a president lost the popular vote but captured enough states to win the electoral vote. This has happened at least once since 2000, and I'm recording this before the election in 2020, so I'm not quite sure what the outcome is going to be. It took 5 weeks to determine the election's outcome, which hinged upon a few hundred votes in Florida. The U.S. Supreme Court halted a recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court on the grounds that it violated a couple of principles. And so it was the Supreme Court that ultimately decided the 2000 election. And in 2001, 9 months after President Bush entered office, terrorists destroyed the New York World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon. Almost 3,000 people were killed during the September 11th terrorist attacks, which triggered major U.S. initiatives to combat terrorism, and it would define the presidency of George W. Bush. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban, who had been former allies, and then in 2003, the U.S.-led war in Iraq began. Since 2001, over 2.75 million service members have served on 5.4 million deployments. The Army accounted for the bulk of that. An estimated 11% of Afghanistan and 20% of Iraq veterans suffered from PTSD, as well as an estimated 50,000 American veterans are homeless, with 25% of military stamps using food stamps. And so, sadly, though not surprisingly, much of the pressure to provide sufficient care has come from veterans groups, just as we saw after World War I with the Bonus Army. So groups like the Wounded Warrior Project trying to account for some lapses that one might imagine other sources caring for. The war will cost American taxpayers anywhere between $4 and $6 trillion. And again, much of that is not being absorbed into the care needed for veterans. But the War on Terror also represented a revolution in warfare, the privatization not just of building planes, tanks, and bombs, but of the war itself. So, for example, in 2008, the U.S. Department of Defense employed 155,826 private contractors in Iraq to 152,272 troops. So many of the people who are fighting in this war are privately contracted. And 1 month after September 11th, at the request of the Bush administration, Congress passed the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act, also known as the USA Patriot Act. Congress immediately passed the USA Patriot Act, allowing unprecedented surveillance of citizens, aliens, and visitors. And in 2002, the FBI, CIA, and other enforcement agencies in the Justice Department were consolidated into a Department of Homeland Security. And they used appropriate patriotic tools to expand the Justice Department's ability to administer wiretaps and searches, obtain personal records from third parties, freeze assets, define what is and is not terrorism, and monitor immigration. As you will read in the piece by Edward Snowden, the U.S. government used the newly available tools to gather intelligence on unwitting Americans, U.S. allies, as well as suspected terrorists. So people have really different understandings of Edward Snowden. I'm not asking you to figure out what you think about him, but to read the information that he provides. In the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, activists all over the world mounted what are generally considered among the largest protests in world history. But repression by the police, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security was widespread. With massive anti-terrorism budgets and new Patriot Act tools, those who opposed the war were accused of being communists and aiding the terrorists. Death threats and accusations of being un-American were pervasive through the Bush years. And Iraq veterans against the war were called traitors. And then in 2008, the Great Recession hit. 2.6 million Americans lost their jobs, most in the last few months of Bush's presidency. From 2007 to 2008, U.S. banks foreclosed on 3.6 million homes. By 2010, the richest 20% of Americans held about 85% of the nation's wealth, while 15% of Americans lived in poverty. The richest country on earth also boasted a homeless population of 3.5 million people, while maintaining 18.5 million empty homes. The recession was largely caused by deregulating or removing rules from U.S. banks and the stock market. In effect, stockbrokers were gambling and lost, and the American public paid for it. As Bush left office, the United States experienced the most expensive wars in our history and the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. So, in fall 2011, New Yorkers held round-the-clock protests outside of Wall Street. Again, this context of the worst economic collapse of the Great Depression. And they protested the billions of taxpayer dollars to the people who caused the collapse and the cuts to resources and benefits for ordinary people. So the slogan of Occupy Wall Street was "Banks got bailed out and we got sold out." The protests quickly spread to 950 cities in 82 countries. Many, including Spain and Greece, were already embroiled in their own struggles against austerity cuts. And in this top photo, you can see that there was even at least one Occupy protest in Corpus Christi. The Occupy protests were quickly crushed by the police with the help of the FBI, but other conflicts are ongoing. It's really hard to assess the present, but we may have entered into an era of major protest, on par with the 1930s and the 1960s. So we'll certainly see. But you will read and view a couple of sources that look at some of these 21st century movements, many of which will probably be deeply personal for some of you. But I hope that you will be able to kind of look at them with an objective eye, regardless of how you feel about them, and think about them kind of from a historical perspective. So, good luck.